Good afternoon, fellow ruminators. Welcome back to another session, Rumination with Andrew. Not Rumination with Andrew, but Rumination News Network. Thank you so much for joining. I hope that you would like, share, and subscribing. Well, and subscribe, right? I hope that you'd like, share, and subscribe. I'm a little bit distracted this morning as I record this video for this afternoon. Now we have TNT warns the Caribbean is no longer a zone of peace, crime, or proxy war. At the recent CELAC EU summit, Trinidad and Tobago warned that the Caribbean is no longer a zone of peace, citing rising crime, weapons, and foreign interference. But is it just about crime, or are we seeing the early signs of a new proxy war between the US, Venezuela, and their allies? In this episode of Rumination News Network, we examine how regional instability is being used to reshape Caribbean geopolitics, from Venezuela's oil conflict and US sanctions to the militarization of Caribbean waters. Stay informed, subscribe for real Caribbean analysis beyond the headlines. Now, we're living in some momentous times, times in which we have to make sure that we inform ourselves and we are not deceived, because one of the critical elements of the times in which we live is ubiquitous deception, half truth, propaganda, half lies, here and there, or lies, because half truth and there can't be any half lies, or even half truths are essentially lies, right? Because if you're either telling the truth or you're not telling the truth, it is a truth or it is a lie. Okay, but the fact is that propaganda is what we are receiving today as news. And people everywhere, they tend to read their Guardian newspaper, their Trinidad and Guardian, their Trinidad Guardian, their UK Guardian, their Jamaica Gleaner, and the Barbados Nation, or Today, right? The New York Times, the Washington Post. And many people believe that these newspapers and these media outlets are what give them credible sources of news. But I must say to you that it is not true. And we have to delve in many sources to understand what is truth and to be able to come up with the version of truth that we think it is. And it is not easy, because where do we find the time? For those of us who are working and engaged, where do we find the time, or when do we find the time to sit down and really go through, maybe more than 20 newspapers or more? Plus, you have to engage with the readings of books and other sources. Where do you find the time? When do you find the time? These are critical questions, and most of us, if the truth be told, do not find the time. The time is just not there. We only have 24 hours a day, and we are highly engaged, particularly as life is getting harder economically. So people have to work sometimes one or two jobs, so they don't have time to sit down. So they listen to videos like these for their information. Very important that you like and you subscribe and that you share the video with as many people on the platform. Okay. Now, Trinidad has declared that the zone in which we live is no longer a zone of peace. It is a zone of war. And we know that Trinidad, out of the bat, under the Kamla Persad administration, has been suggesting that we no longer live in a zone of peace. We live in a zone of war. And that is coming out of the playbook of the State Department that Trinidad and Tobago is actually following. And they're not particularly apologetic about their position as far as that is concerned. Okay? Now, there was an article that came out of the Trinidad and Guardian. TNT tells CELAC EU summit region no longer a zone of peace, due to crime. So they're suggesting that because of the high rates of crime in Trinidad, and it is really high, we can't negate that. When you open the papers in Trinidad, you see a lot of deaths, right? You're seeing an increase daily of people either being, also people being kidnapped, abducted. So we can't negate, those of us who are living in reality, that in fact there is an uptick in crime and violence throughout the region, not only in Trinidad, but also in Jamaica. Jamaica has always been known to have a very high homicide rate, but even that has increased. Well, recently they've told us that it has decreased, and because of the draconic measures that the security forces are taking to contain it. So now the Trinidad has joined the war on the drug traffickers and human traffickers, as Jamaica has already joined the wars on the gang, and perhaps Haiti too. Haiti also has a war on the gangs. We see that the United Nations Security Council has instructed that, military be sent to Haiti, a security, force be sent to Haiti to control the gangs, to launch a war on the gangs, as it were. Now, this country is among, that's Trinidad and Tobago, among the European Union and 18 Latin American and Caribbean countries or states that have launched the EU Latin America and the Caribbean Alliance for Citizen Security, aimed at strengthening cooperation on citizen security between the EU and LAC countries. And I would think that is CLAC countries, countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, what is interesting is that they have aborted, as it were, or abandoned their campaign, that's the US, of spreading democracy and freedom, right? Freedom and democracy were the underlying words, right? Were the mantra of yesteryear, of yesterday. Now we're hearing is peace and security. Okay, so they know that they have already lost the narrative on democracy and freedom and democracy, because nobody bought into that. People realize that the United States is neither a democracy nor a free nation. So because that narrative has been lost, the United States has now adopted a new narrative, a new mantra, suggesting that they are there spreading peace and security around the world. And they're asking nations to join them. Because don't we want to live in peace? Absolutely. The normal human wants to live in peace. The majority of us, some of us don't, but the majority of the human populace would like to live in peace. Right? We don't want people to be warring around us and lots of bombings and, and deaths and so forth. For the most part, we are human beings and we don't like to see that. It hurts our human sensibilities, doesn't it? So absolutely. So the fact of the matter is that that is why we do not really buy into wars. However, our leaders are telling us that in order for us to have peace, we have to buy into wars, because they're now waging a war throughout the world, particularly in the region, what we call Latin America and the Caribbean region. But that is nothing but US propaganda to militarize and to control the region's resources. Now, how much are our leaders attuned to this agenda? I don't know. Some of them might be, some of them might not be. What is interesting is that sometimes it seems that we're looking at all of these oppositional forces, which people call controlled opposition, that maybe they are on the agenda, but they pretend as if they're not on the agenda to let us join sides with them, and then they betray us. So we have to be careful when you're joining the upper, because once it's politics, it's more than likely that they are of one mind and that they are of the same agenda. They have different approach to achieving the same agenda, and that is why you see some amount of conflict and division. But the agenda is the same, and that is global governance, with the elites standing at the top and we, the ordinary citizens, as the plebs or the slaves, to do their bidding. That is the agenda. That is the permanent agenda. It is not to liberate us and to have us live in peace and security. It is the complete opposite, for us to live in a zone of war and confusion. And what happened in the Middle East, particularly in Iraq, in Syria, among other nations, in Libya, we should use that as the guarding signs, as the guard posts or the guard rails for the guard posts, I should say, the signs, the exemplars, I should say, of what lies ahead of us, right? It is going to be that we're going to live in confusion and we are going to be engulfed, thrust in a world of total chaos and warfare, unending warfares, I should say. So Trinidad has devoted itself that it wants to live in a zone of peace. So therefore, it has to ensure that it is actually waging a war on the gangs. CARICOM attendees included Grenada Prime Minister Dickon Mitchell, St. Kitts Prime Minister Terence Drew, and others. United National Congress, that's the UNC, stated on Facebook that Trinidad and Tobago was represented by Parliamentary Secretary in the Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs Ministry, that's Nicholas Morris. He called for greater international collaboration to combat narco trafficking and transnational crime, saying these issues have eroded peace and security in Trinidad and Tobago. But, we've been having narco trafficking and transnational crimes forever. If you should check the Epstein files, right, and people have reported, well, they haven't reported on these files, but they have reported on what has been made known to the public. And Epstein was around from the 1980s, 1990s. Right? So the fact of the matter is that we've been having these things forever. Even before that, even before Epstein, we've been having drug trafficking and human trafficking. It's been in the world for a long, long time. In fact, what was slavery? Slavery was about human trafficking, wasn't it? That's what it was. And they raped the women and they did all sort of things to the women. And slavery hasn't ended. Right? Chattel slavery has ended, but slavery in its rightful, as used in its rightful sense, has not been ended. It still operates. Slavery still continues in other parts of the world. Okay, sometimes we're not. Sometimes it might be in our neck of the woods too, but we don't know about what is happening behind the scenes. Right now, we don't endorse human trafficking. We don't endorse human sacrifice, but these things exist in our world, including in the Western world, right? And some of the places that I should call, if I should call them now, you'll be surprised, okay? And the United States is not launching a war on these places or on these people, but the United States also is involved. We see what happened during the Epstein, and that is why Trump is not going to declassify the Epstein files, because in them we would see a lot of things, unsavory things that we would not want to see. All right, salacious activities, right? We would not want to really be engaged or even to read about. Now, speaking at the fourth rather, CELAC EU summit in Santa Marta, Colombia, Morris said the country no longer exists in a zone of peace because of the serious impact of drug and human trafficking across the region. He told delegates that while Trinidad and Tobago values peace as a supreme asset, its reality over the past 2 decades has been shaped by organized crime and its social and economic consequences. So that's why he has to now join efforts with the United States to see ways in which they can actually create, fashion, craft a peaceful society. Okay? So that is what they're trying to do. Now, the Venezuelan president was not there, so the Venezuelan president, Maduro's letter to the heads of CELAC member states cited the recent destruction of vessels at sea, which was condemned by the UN. He called for an investigation into the executions and noted that the deployment of U.S. military forces near Venezuela's coastal borders. Maduro urged all countries to unite in a single voice against attacks and military threats and to demand their immediate cessation. And this morning we woke up again to hear that 2 other boats or 3 boats were actually struck with many people, well, with some people dying. And this seems to have it's now the norm for the United States to shoot up both boats in the Eastern Pacific region and also in Caribbean waters, right? That has become a normal occurrence, and we're not hearing much coming from our prime ministers, from our CARICOM officials, And from the leaders in Latin America, only we're hearing the Colombian Prime Minister, Pedro Gustavo, or Gustavo Petro, which one, yeah, I think it's the opposite. Yeah, he's the president of Colombia. Now, he has been speaking out against what is happening, and also, of course, the Venezuelan president, Maduro, Nicolas Maduro, who is enemy number one of the United States in the region. And for that reason, they're looking to wage a war against him, President Maduro. Now, what is this matter of peace? Is the United States trying to really usher in peace in the region? I don't think so. Okay. Now, there is an article that was written here in Counterpunch and dated today, November 11th, 2025, the U.S. war on China, Venezuela, and international left. So we have here the U.S. is waging a war on all three fronts: China, Venezuela, and the international left. And by that, they mean the international progressives. Okay, that is what the writer of the article is suggesting. Over the past month, the Trump administration has unleashed a series of strikes on Venezuela fishing vessels, claiming they are cracking down on drug smugglers. The lie is as unoriginal as it is absurd, and a stark example of the waning facade of the supposed morality of liberal internationalism. Truth is often exposed during these periods of turbulence when agitation overrides calculation. The knowledge of its imminent demise is so dire that the empire is barely trying to hide its true intentions anywhere or anymore. Now, what is the truth then? That's the question that is being asked. What is the truth then? The truth is that the United States war on Venezuela has nothing to do with drugs and everything to do with control. And that's what I've been telling you. For years, Venezuela has faced relentless pressure, economic warfare, sanctions, and constant threats designed to undermine its sovereignty and keep it under the boot of U.S. empire. As with most nations, U.S. interest in Venezuela is about strategic resources and power. First, Venezuela sits atop the largest proven oil reserves in the world, along with significant deposits of gold, coltan, and other minerals critical to technology and energy production. Control over these strategic resources means control over global markets and energy security. Second, Venezuela's geographic location within Latin America makes the pivotal point of leverage within the region. Yet, Venezuela's defiance did not emerge in a vacuum. It followed more than a century of U.S. domination across the hemisphere, from the invasion of Haiti and the occupation of Nicaragua to the coups in Guatemala, Chile, and Honduras. What unites these histories is a single message from Washington: no Latin American nation has the right to chart an independent course. Right? That is what no country in Latin America has the right to chart an independent course. That's the message that Washington is sending to the region. So if Jamaica wants to chart an independent course, if Trinidad wants to chart an independent course, that's Trinidad and Tobago. If Guyana, if Honduras, if Nicaragua, if Chile, if Colombia, if all of these nations within the Caribbean and Latin American zone desire to chart an independent course, they will be quashed. And they will be told that they're actually, nations of insecurity. And whatever propaganda that the United States seeks to impose on them. That is what you have to understand. So obviously, Kamala Persson-Bissessar is not charting an independent path or course. She's actually following slavishly U.S. diktats and demands. Very important that you understand that. So this is the truth of the matter. The truth is that the United States is not waging a war to combat narco-terrorists or narco-trafficking or human trafficking in the region. All right? It is the complete opposite. It is trying to cement its power in the region and also to control, as it were, the drug trade, and that there should be no competitor. Now, the article went on to say that the United States is also trying to contain China in the region because China has huge investments in Venezuela. So if the United States launches a war against Venezuela, it has to also launch a war against China by default and Russia. Okay? These two countries have investments and have interests, economic interests in Venezuela. And the article informed us, rightly so, that the Chinese have been in Venezuela since 2000 when President Hugo Chavez was alive. And that China does provide enormous amount of energy to China. Okay? So the fact of the matter is that would you want to give up this sort of economic opportunity on both sides of the Atlantic, of the world? China would not want to give up that economic relationship and partnership, neither would Venezuela, all right, through the Belt and Road Initiative. So the fact is that if the United States launches a war against China, it is also indirectly launching a war on China and to some extent on Russia. Okay, so this is going to be a very big war, as it were. Okay? Now, the lesson is clear. Where there's a US-backed war or intervention, you are likely to find some strategic resource or monetary interest beneath it. And that's the whole point. Where there is a US-backed war or intervention, you are likely to find some strategic resource or monetary interest beneath it. And that is why Smedley Butler wrote the book, War is a Racket. This is what it means to be an imperialist power. In order to sustain its dominance, the US must continually extract, control, or deny access to the materials that sustain global industry and technology, such as oil, gas, lithium, and rare earth minerals. And when another nation dares to assert sovereignty over its own resources, it is branded a threat to freedom, sanctioned, bombed, or toppled to keep it dependent, weak, and loyal. China, Venezuela, and all nations seeking sovereignty over their own development in ways contradictory to the capitalist imperial order threaten this. And that is why they are targeted, not for any moral or legal reason. And when he uses the word capital order here, I would say that it is the neoliberal capitalist imperial order. Because there's nothing wrong with capitalism, but the neoliberal brand of capitalism is toxic. It is toxic. As we've so clearly seen from 2 years of US-funded genocide in Gaza, neither morality nor legality guides US policy. Yeah, why would you think that morality and legality guide US policy when we're seeing all of the wars that have been waged in the world and how they have been waged? The faulty pretexts that have been advanced. Yet still, it happens and nobody can say anything to the United States. And that is why I'm wondering what multipolar world we're living in. Because if Russia does it, the UN is going to say a lot of things and perhaps discipline Russia. If China does it, the same would happen. Other nations and the United States would also criticize very heavily and force the United Nations to impose sanctions on those countries. Yet the US can do whatever it wants to do and gets away with it. So what multipolar world are we living in? And we need to get out of that brainwashing that we're living in a multipolar world, because we're not. The United States, we're living in a unipolar world where the United States runs the show. Well, it might not run the show to a large extent in some nations like Russia and Iran, and that's why it's going after them, and China and North Korea. But to a large extent, the US runs the show. And some people argue that in Burkina Faso, also in Africa, and the Sahel group of countries, that the United States doesn't run the show. Well, we don't know everything that is happening in the Sahel countries. We can only speculate as what is happening there, right? Lots of things we are not aware of. But I end the video today here with a quotation from Chalmers Johnson's book, The Sorrow of Empire, Militarism, Secrecy, and the End of the Republic. And I think the Republic has already died, and we are living in a full-blown empire called the United States. Some people say the divided states of America. It's no longer the United States. of America. You decide. I shall not say what I think as regards that particular expression, divided states of America. Now, there is plenty in the world to occupy our military radicals and empire enthusiasts for the time being. That is what Chalmers Johnson is saying. But there can be no doubt that the course on which we are launched will lead us into new versions of the Bay of Pigs, which is now about to happen in Venezuela, and updated, speeded up replays of Vietnam War scenarios. And we're hearing that the United States, as we speak, is actually training its military in Panama for jungle, what do you call it now, warfare, because they know that there are lots of jungles in Venezuela, so they're making sure that their soldiers are equipped to combat those warriors. When such disasters occur, as they are, or as yet unknown versions of them certainly will, a world disgusted by the betrayal of the idealism associated with the United States will welcome them, just as most people did when the former USSR came apart. Like other empires of the past century, the United States has chosen to live not prudently in peace and prosperity, but as a massive military power, right? As a massive military power. That's what he is here suggesting. Athwart an angry, resistant globe. Right? So the United States could have decided to live peace and prosperity. Yes, you're going to have problems because we're living in a sinful world with human beings who, are not necessarily good individuals or moral law-abiding citizens, morally upright people. So we'll have those people to deal with, and we can sit down and come up with ways in which we can help to contain these people. But the United States says, no, we want to have control. There is one development that could conceivably stop the process of overreaching. The people could retake control of Congress, reform it along with the corrupted election laws that have made it into a forum for special interests, turn it into a genuine assembly of democratic representatives, and cut off the supply of money to the Pentagon and the secret intelligence agencies. Hear that? That we should cut off the supplies of money going to the Pentagon and the secret intelligence agencies. We have a strong civil society that could, in theory, overcome the entrenched interests of the armed forces and the military. I don't think it can be done right now. Industrial complex. At this late stage, however, it is difficult to imagine how Congress, much like the Roman Senate in the last days of the Republic, could be brought back to life and cleansed of its endemic corruption. Failing such a reform, Nemesis, the goddess of retribution and vengeance, the punisher of pride and hubris, waits impatiently for her meeting with us. So the United States citizens are going to have to suffer because of the pain that the United States has unleashed on a lot of the world. Okay? And they will have to suffer and even suffer more, because the Bible says, and people know that to whom much is given, much is required. Okay, and the United States has gotten a lot of blessings, but it has wasted its blessings and continues to do so by killing, maiming, and demolishing people's livelihoods and people's lives themselves, injuring them, maiming them, creating chaos and havoc to their daily lives. So let us see where this is going as Trinidad calls for a zone of peace, saying that we're living in a zone of war. And I wonder what the Trinidadian officials are thinking. Have they ever seen a war zone area, or they're just speaking because they're just bought out and sold? I don't know. You can tell me. Let me know. Thank you so much for joining. I hope that you like, share, and subscribe. Like the videos. The videos can be shared with as many people on the platform. For those of you who'd like to make a monetary donation, you can send it to my Cash App, the $MZTUCK9. The $MZTUCK9. Thank you so much for joining and see you in another one. Adios.